Hello, everyone. Welcome back from the break. I hope it was restful for you and you got caught up on any reading that you needed to do, as well as assignments. This is your week 10 lecture. We are continuing with thinking about managing the nation, and this is a continuation from the last lecture where we were talking about Puerto Rico. We also talked about Linda Gordon's account of race and shifting across territory with the Great Arizona Orphan Abduction. If you haven't watched that lecture video, I hope that you check it out or take a look at it. It has some important stuff, especially around Kaplan in it, as well as laying some of the groundwork for this one. So, though we are covering a lot of legal and legislative procedure, we are not so much asking a legal question about citizenship, but its cultural and ideological meaning. The idea of the immigrant is a prevalent one. You often hear the US referred to as a nation of immigrants. But who counts as an immigrant and who counts as a native in the cultural imagination has continued to evolve and relies on sets of assumptions about people and their relationship to territory of the nation and the national identity. Culturally, citizenship has become a shorthand for what kind of person someone is, their social value. It is also part of a dialectic relationship whereby the American identity comes to define itself against those it classifies as ineligible for membership. Today, we will take a quick look at the document detailing the final assignments for the course, which are all related to our mini teach-in conference. We'll look at the provocation, and then we're discussing the question of the national native and the immigrant other, the legal citizen and the illegal migrant, and the history of these designations and their conceptual and cultural implications, especially with regard to race in the American imagination. We are still talking about what it means to manage the nation, the administration of identity through legal and territorial mechanisms, and the impact these modes of management have on culture. So this is the mini teach-in assignment document. If you have not taken a look at it, please do. You can take a read through it to get a good idea. You do have to start contacting your groups pretty quickly here. So it's important that you familiarize yourselves with this document as soon as you can. You can find this in the course files. It's also posted in modules, I believe, and then it's also it's in under assignments as well. So our teach-in, we've talked a little bit about teach-ins, or at least I did in the first lecture that we had where we went through the syllabus, but we're doing kind of like a mini teach-in conference. Teach-ins are a big part of politics and culture of the American university. Normally, professors and students would host a teach-in about a particular subject related to a certain social struggle happening or a larger sort of political issue, either happening on campus or related, or at least just happening in the nation or the world at large. Many of them have involved things like war, poverty, racism, sexism, but they can take on any number of specific issues. And it's usually a way of like connecting academic disciplines to people outside of the university because it's not a class. Anyone can come to a teach-in. Our teach-in will be closed, of course. It will just be between you as participants. It's not necessarily meant to be seen by people outside of the course, and it will just be through videos on Canvas. Our teach-in has three themes, and they are based on Amy Kaplan's three categories for relating academic scholarship to the struggles of the world from that early reading from the course that we had, violent belongings. So the three themes are homeland, empire, American studies. There's separate panels. You have been assigned a panel through Canvas in groups. You can access your group either through groups in Canvas, or you can just message and you can go to your group page. So groups is in Canvas. It's not in the course. It's in the larger Canvas panel options. So you can find groups there, or you can just message your group through Canvas inbox. When you go into the field where you say who your message is to, you can send a message to an individual, or you can send a message to a group. And your group will pop up. It will be Homeland Panel 1, Homeland Panel 2, Empire Panel 3, Empire Panel 4. The assignment has these three components. So you have this group topic and coordination worth 5%, individual panel presentation that's worth 15%, and a teach-in final reflection paper worth 25%. And that's where you will reflect. You will have watched everybody's presentations in the different panels, and you will write a short reflection paper about the shifting in your thinking, or you're thinking about American Studies as a whole as a result of our teach-in conference. And just a reminder, the group topic and individual panel presentations do not qualify for the automatic grace period. And that's because everyone else is sort of relying on you turning these in. So they don't have the automatic extension, just the written assignments have automatic grace period attached to them. The due date for the group topic and coordination is April 20th. Just some things to note. Again, you can read through this in your own time. You must communicate with me any issues you have with contacting your group well in advance of the deadline. You should be sending those messages out and responding to others as soon as possible. Again, you can post in your page and through either announcements, and you have your own discussion board if you go access your group page through groups on Canvas. And you can also, and then again, or you just use Canvas inbox. And then if you choose to communicate through some kind of group me or something after that, that's fine, but that's for yourselves to arrange. This is the only group activity you have. It's narrowing down your topic. So you get assigned your theme and you know what it is based on the name of your group. And then from there, you want to narrow down that theme into a specific topic that each of you is going to be presenting in relation to. So your individual presentations will be a part of this theme for your panel. All of you will be contributing to a single panel. The group work is part of this because the conference panels often require some kind of coordination if you haven't been to any academic panels or panel presentations before. But it's also a resource. You will be able to brainstorm and discuss your individual presentations with others. And then just as a final reminder, even with the individual presentations, which are not due until they're due the next week, April 27th, that you have to submit them in two places. So you submit your individual video presentation either to or to both, sorry, not either, but you submit it to the assignment portal on Canvas, then you also post it to the discussion board. And the discussion board will have your summary that you all have submitted to me, this like paragraph description of your panel. That's that group topic and coordination. That will be posted to the discussion board, and you will reply to that discussion thread, your panel's discussion thread with your video. You will then be able to just see everybody else's by going into the other discussion board threads. I will go over this again in more detail as in some future in future lecture videos as well. So this isn't the only introduction, but this is just so that you see this and you have an idea of where it is. It's in all of the usual documents places. Same here with the panel topic and theme assignment sheet, which is what you will be submitting with your paragraph, topic description, and the names of the people who contributed with your assigned theme and panel title. So you'll submit that. This is what you submit April 20th, and your individual panel presentations April 27th. And again, I'll go into more detail about the paper later too, especially after we're done. So this is your, sorry, I'm just going to move me around a little bit. This is your provocation for today. Remember to pause and fill out those first two sections of your reflection worksheet. You can pause the video and read it. You also have access. I will also have posted this this provocation to the supplementary files on Canvas. So last class we discussed the category of immigrant as a racial one, like in the case of Puerto Rico, and we previously saw with Anzaldúa and Linda Gordon. One does not necessarily even need to technically have been an immigrant or a citizen to be considered either. That this relationship between citizen and immigrant is one that develops over time and it seems to be disconnected. It's connected to the legal designations, but it also shifts around. So I thought too that I would offer you a quick timeline of significant events regarding immigration restriction as a legal and legislative regime, some of which we've already learned about. But this is, just so you know, like immigration restriction, it didn't always exist. So it comes about. Same with the concept of citizenship. It sort of gets worked out over time. This is not a complete list, especially because it's legislatively focused and on citizenship and immigration. There's other events in here that certainly contribute, especially around like World War II, Japanese internment, but this is just thinking about the legislative sort of end of it as well as the legal end of it. So if you recall, 1857, we get the Dred Scott case, also known as the Dred Scott v. Sanford for the Supreme Court ruling. And we talked about that a bit last time. The US Supreme Court rules that people of African descent are not citizens and therefore cannot file suit under the federal court or federal law. This also rules individual suits for freedom, like that Dred Scott was making at the time as an enslaved person, that his seeking of freedom violated the right of actual citizens to private property, like his owner, to their private property, and him being the property. So this is considered a historical flashpoint in the lead up to the Civil War, but it's for us a beginning of really sorting out who is a citizen and who is not. And if you remember, this case is cited in Downs v. Bidwell as a justification for why Puerto Rico is not considered to have states' rights. Then we get the Immigration Act of 1882, and this is sort of really, these are the first laws that start restricting immigration. And the first two kinds of immigration restriction are one on the basis of disability. So the Immigration Act of 1882 excludes, quote, lunatics, idiots, or any person unable to take care of himself or herself. The poor and disabled are labeled as undesirable and burdensome, and they are restricted from immigrating and becoming citizens. At this point, and you have to think about it this way, at this point, especially in the wake of the loss of slavery, the ruling class is especially interested in labor and cheap labor to make up for some of these losses of the enslaved, and as well as in Western expansion, right? The country's really expanding economically. It wants a lot of labor and cheap labor. As we saw in Linda Gordon's work, the Mexican-Anglo divide in Arizona, and much of that racial animus is driven by the titans of those mining industries as a way to extract extra profit from what they considered foreign workers, even though the Mexican workers there had not actually moved. They were relatively in the same area as they had been for many, many years. The US had moved. The border of the United States had expanded westward. But as a result, there is increasing pressure from those non-Black laborers for the government to protect their wages and work when there's these new peoples who they believe should fall below them in the racial order. And those new peoples are the ones who are immigrating across the Pacific, because now with Western expansion, it opens up those other ports and more people crossing over from that direction. So also in 1882, we get the Chinese Exclusion Act, and this is probably the single most important piece of legislation for the entire global immigration regime. The idea that people could be excluded from citizenship and immigration to other countries on the basis of race or national origin. This is the kind of beginning. And then now to this day, we're really left globally with the legacy of this. So it is a 10-year ban on Chinese laborers immigrating to the US. It is the first major law to do this, to make this restriction on the basis of race. As part of the justification, it works kind of closely with the other act that restricts disability and infirmity, because part of the justification that is made around Chinese exclusion is this sort of racialized conception that the Chinese bring prostitution and disease, that they are compromising the spiritual and physical health of the nation. That there's a lot of discussion of them being backwards. China still had feudal governance at that point, and their backwardness is treated also as a kind of political contagion. And we can think a little bit too about the searchers and the idea that Indianness was a contagion as well. But the idea was that it might corrupt American republicanism, that the Chinese migrant would bring these bad ideas about governance. When the 10 years are up, the Chinese Exclusion Act gets extended in 1892 and made permanent in 1902. 1891, Congress establishes the Bureau of Immigration. This is the agency that will eventually become Immigration and Naturalization Services, INS, until about 2003. And it was previously contained inside the Department of Justice, and it was totally belonged to the legal court and criminal system. But after 9/11, INS becomes the U.S. Or sorry, this isn't when it's part of the court system, but it's still part of the Department of Justice. After 9/11, the INS becomes the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, and that's what it is to this day. And it gets moved from the Department of Justice to the newly created Department of Homeland Security. But up until the point that Congress establishes the Bureau of Immigration, the questions and of citizenship and deportation were matters of the criminal court. So moving immigration, this is the big thing that the US does. Its big innovation around immigration is it moves immigration from the courts to a government administrative body, and that really changes the game. Chinese laborers at the time, especially, were challenging their denial of citizenship and deportations via habeas corpus writs in U.S. criminal courts, and they were winning because they were being unlawfully detained or unconstitutionally detained. So moving immigration proceedings out of the courts, and there's really some very interesting rulings from judges who are like very racist, and they're being like, I really wish there was another way here. I have to let these Chinese people stay, and I really don't want to. Like that's what a lot of the rulings were looking out were reading like at the time. So the US is like, okay, we can't have immigration be a part of the courts because then we have to keep letting people stay. So they invent this Bureau of Immigration and decide immigration is no longer like a kind of court matter where judges would rule over it. It is instead an administrative matter, and people do not get to go through regular justice appeals around it. It has a dramatic impact not only on the United States, but the world. Most countries have followed suit, and immigration is really no longer a matter for courts, but government administrative bodies, and therefore immigrants' rights sit in those kind of shadowy gray areas or gray zones that Kaplan discusses and that we talked about with respect to Puerto Rico, both having some rights, but not really. There's no mechanism to really challenge or enforce it. 1906, we get the Naturalization Act. It establishes a process of denaturalization, or the process of stripping somebody of citizenship. Causes of denaturalization in this act included fraud, racial ineligibility, and the lack of, quote, good moral character. So only people who can be naturalized at that point, according to this act, are, quote, free white persons and, quote, aliens of African nativity and persons of African descent. So they're not quite citizens, they kind of are, but they can be naturalized. Western expansion meant establishment of Pacific ports. And then again, this increase of immigration of laborers from India, China, and Japan via the Pacific Ocean. They're working in transportation and infrastructure like railways, as well as lumber and mining industries. And this is the big push around denaturalizing citizens. 1907, you get the Expatriation Act, and that is where women are denaturalized if they marry foreigners. Men are not, it's only women. And so this is the gendered component of citizenship. Women's citizenship can be stripped from them should they marry a foreigner. There's a really important Supreme Court case, 1915's Mackenzie v. Hare. That is where a woman married a British citizen. She challenged the Expatriation Act as unconstitutional in the court, but the court upheld it. They said she made her choice and she gave away her citizenship by marrying. It was a British citizen, but he was from Scotland. They had both lived in California for many years. It also established, too, that citizenship was not a right and it was not protected by the Constitution. 1917, when the U.S. joins World War I, American women married to German men are denaturalized and they are registered as enemy aliens, despite the fact that they may have been born in the United States, but they are stripped of their status. Then we get the 1917 Immigration Act. This extends the Chinese ban to all immigrants from the, quote, Asiatic barred zone. If you have done your reading, you've read Mae Nai, she talks about this Asiatic barred zone. So anyone who's immigrated from the zone is now ineligible for citizenship. This was not necessarily a deportation order, but an ordering of people in society in terms of access to rights. Remember, with the Dred Scott case, he was ruled ineligible to seek legal remedy for enslavement. He did not have what was called legal personhood. And so this is kind of what's being stripped from people. They are not legally persons under the law. Then we get a couple of really important Supreme Court cases that challenge these acts. 1922, we get Ozawa versus the United States. Takao Ozawa, immigrant, he was an immigrant from Japan. He argues he is white because he has light skin color, is a Christian, and is fluent in English. He's like, this is what you all say is white. I'm white. I have these things. The court rules that Ozawa is, quote, a Japanese born in Japan, being clearly not Caucasian, cannot be made a citizen of the United States. So that's just their ruling. They're like, you're just clearly not Caucasian. You're from Japan. So then in 1923, United States versus Thind, Bhagat Singh Thind, he enlisted in the U.S. Army and fought in World War I, and he was naturalized through that process. He's originally from India. The U.S. denaturalized citizens of Indian origin through that act. And the court rules that Indian Americans are racially ineligible for citizenship. He challenges this. And remember that the law is very concerned with precedent. And so he says in the Ozawa ruling, you argued that Ozawa wasn't a citizen because he wasn't Caucasian, but I am Caucasian. And he says that the area he was from was invaded by Aryans at one point in history. And so he was probably Aryan by blood. And therefore, by the court's definition, which did not accept Ozawa's case about skin color, he's like, I don't have the skin color, but I do have the Caucasian heritage. The court accepts his argument. They say that Thind is indeed Caucasian, but, quote, what we hold is that the words free white persons are words of common speech to be interpreted in accordance with the understanding of the common man, synonymous with the word Caucasian, only as that word is popularly understood. What both Thind and Ozawa forced the state to do is define the category white. If you recall again from that case, Downs v. Bidwell, the court relied on the term Anglo-Saxon, that the U.S. and U.S. citizens were Anglo-Saxon in character. But that was too narrow to cover an expanding notion of whiteness, like what we saw happen with the orphans in Arizona who were Irish. Anglo-Saxon does not include Germans, it does not include the Irish, it does not include pretty much anybody outside of English descent. And with so many formerly enslaved Black people and now increasing number of indigenous Mexicans, more people crossing the Pacific Ocean, the US ruling class who justified their racial order of their society through notions of civilized whiteness, they need to consolidate that power, and they need to maintain the order by expanding their numbers of white people through the expansion of that category. In the Ozawa and Tin cases, we can see new white person, or we can see new language enter into the official narrative. Citizens are free white persons, and that definition of a racial category is not primarily scientific, anthropological, or historical in definition as it had been previously established in Ozawa. It is now a cultural phenomena. It is popularly understood by the common man. And so the American identity becomes kind of irrevocably tied to these ideas: legal citizenship, racial identity, gender, ability, illness, sanity, and relationship to enslavement. That's the free part of the free white persons. So much so that particular phrase becomes culturally popular to express the freedom and permissiveness of the American spirit. The phrase that people would say is, "I'm free, white, and 21." And if you ever want to Google, there's a compilation put together by the website Jezebel of the many times it's appeared in film for like 40 years. Just a very popular, common phrase like, "I can do whatever I want. I'm free, white, 21." So this brings us up to the Immigration Act of 1924. There's some further immigration acts that become really important, including the Hart-Celler Act and the invention of the illegal Mexican immigrant. But the one that we're looking at today is the 1924 Immigration Act, or the Johnson-Reed Act. So this is because this is the chapter from Mae Nye's Sociological History of Immigration Restriction in the United States. It's a book called Impossible Subjects: Illegal Aliens and the Making of Modern America, which is thinking even more specifically than the category immigrant, but the category illegal immigrant or alien. We saw these categories in those bracketed tags from Jose Olivares's poem Citizen Illegal. To him, it seems citizen and illegal are distinct and racialized along the lines of national origin, with Mexican and American, but also culturalized in terms of actions, behaviors, and preferences. Illegal seems to be anyone or anything that the dominant culture is dismissive of. In the poem, even categories like women and color get tagged as illegal, which means, in the logic of the poem, just like in the history of immigration restriction, citizenship isn't just a legal designation, but an ideological and cultural one. So you read from the first chapter of Mae Nye's Impossible Subjects, the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, and the reconstruction of race and immigration law. Nye's book is a seminal one for our entry into thinking about ideas about the nation and how it is managed, both in terms of who is included and who is excluded, but also how these imaginings are built up and supported by the law, and vice versa. Some of her main arguments in her book, which are deceptively simple but important for us to keep in mind, that the figure of the illegal alien or illegal immigrant that has become so central and normative in the American social landscape, including its cultural imagination, is not a natural category. You are all living in the wake of a federal election, and it is probably not uncommon, and we've talked about this before, to hear politicians address that problem of the illegal or undocumented immigration. It is not something anyone discusses with any sense of history, however, but rather as an obviously nationally important issue with the kind of common sense that the court used in the Tind case to establish racial lines. Nye's argument is that this process of making the question of legal and illegal immigration a matter of common and cultural sense was both recent and very fast in terms of its history, and mostly happens between 1924 and 1965. And she argues that the introduction of immigration restriction had everything to do with how race was being understood as a fundament of the nation, the expansion of its ideas, as we said, from white and the white black formulation arising out of enslavement and into the white non-white bifurcation we've discussed before, and its relationship to concepts about purity, racial purity, and racial supremacy. She also argues importantly that there is no illegal immigrant without a set of laws to mark those moving across the border, and also without the ability to and the performance of deportations. No one is really illegal if there is no normative and demonstrative mechanism to remove them, like an enforcement mechanism. So the idea of illegal immigrants is a new one because those laws and infrastructures don't really get worked out until the 20th century, until the 1900s. So she opens this chapter with a quote from another historian, John Higham, about the cluster of laws that pop up about what he calls the upthrust of nativism in the early 20th century. And he says that America would never be the same again, either in its social structure or habits of mind. And I want us to think about this habits of mind. The term nativism is important for us here, and John Higham is central to our understanding of it. Nativism refers to the, quote, negative ethnocentric responses of native-born populations towards immigrants. And this is something that John Higham elaborated as an ideological movement in his book, Strangers in the Land. When we're thinking about nativism, what is interesting to consider here too, that perhaps Nye spends less time on, is that with the construction of the illegal immigrant, we also get the construction of the citizen. This is what Jose Olivares' poem does for us, brings into sharp relief that perhaps there is no citizen without the illegal one. And then again, if you recall that term we talked about early in the course, dialectic. Conceptually, there is no wealth without poverty, there is no tall without short, and there is no legal citizen without illegal alien. One's identity as a legal American citizen is bound up with the existence and persistence of the illegal alien and all the imaginative baggage that comes with both. So when we think of like that free white and 21, even those identifications where you have all these young people in film and television and just expressively being like, I'm free, white, and 21, they're thinking about themselves comparatively with the people who are not free, not white, not 21. And then we want to think about Deloria, too, who showed us that the key to the founding ideas of the nation is those early European descended Americans to reinvent themselves as indigenous or native to the land. One way they did that was by donning costumes or playing Indian. But another imaginative method, too, seems to be by establishing categories of people who can never be native to the land. So the Johnson-Reed Act, this is straight from the book. It was the nation's first comprehensive restriction law. It established for the first time numerical limits on immigration, so numbers of people that could come into the country, and a global racial and national hierarchy that favored some immigrants over others. The regime of immigration restriction remapped the nation in two important ways, she says. First, it drew new ethnic and racial map based on new categories and hierarchies of difference. And second, in a different register, it articulated a new sense of territoriality, which was marked by unprecedented awareness and state surveillance of the nation's contiguous land borders. And it's really based on this idea of the national quota system, which gets introduced in 1921. And it comes on the heels of Chinese and then broader Asian exclusion from the possibility of citizenship in the US. These quotas were originally put together, and quotas meaning like a minimum amount or like the amount of things that can happen. And it was originally based on a census taken in 1910, which skewed in favor of foreign-born Western Europeans more so than did the most recent census in 1920. But John Trevor, who helped craft the act, he successfully argues for a quota system based on national origins as a racial strain and identity rather than an indication of where one was born. So he does this not so this to not disadvantage native born Americans in this calculation. And thus, whatever the quotas were, they should be based not only on who was currently arriving, but on who was already here. This is the argument he makes, and to ensure a continued racial composition of the country. He said the country at a certain point is made up of these kinds of people whose ancestors come from this kind of place, this national origin. We should decide who gets to immigrate here based on keeping those proportions in place. However, he ends up needing to kind of change this around a little bit because there's a lot more people coming from other places recently, so they end up basing the calculating the quotas based on the population and census of 1890. That way, they can keep it really English, really German, and not be called and not be declared discriminatory because they gave fair representation to each nation's racial strains. So, taken together, these three components of the Immigration Act of 1924, they construct a vision of the American nation. This is a direct quote from Nye. They construct a vision of the American nation that embodied certain hierarchies of race and nationality. At its core, the law served contemporary prejudices among white Protestant Americans from Northern European backgrounds and their desire to maintain social and political dominance. These prejudices had informed the restrictionist movement since the late 19th century, but the nativism that impelled the passage of the Act of 1924 articulated a new kind of thinking in which the cultural nationalism of the late 19th century had transformed into nationalism based on race. And so she also gets into the rise of nativism and the restrictionist movements. We get terms like alien, racial indigestion. They begin to pop up. And these ideas are moving from cultural homogeneity back to racial supremacy. So it's fine if there's other people around, but they've got to get ordered and they have to stay as what we would call minority populations. We also get the eugenics movement and the biological determinist view of race around poverty, disability, and criminality. Racial others are kind of deemed as unassimilable, like they can't possibly be absorbed into the nation. And we saw that with Puerto Rico, right? They're just too foreign in their blood. They'll never be able to adopt these ideas and adjust to, quote, civilization. And this becomes the basis for genocides like the Holocaust and the ideas that genetic impurities of these backwards nations, they either need to be eliminated or bred out. And that's the idea of eugenics. But the national origins quota system kind of shifts this by maintaining that not all European immigrants could be Americans, even as it maintained their superiority as technically white. The whiteness of Eastern and Southern Europeans is limited and hierarchized by the law. And remember, we saw this before with the Irish. You can see they're compared cranially. This is the scientific racism, like their skulls are very ape-like and similar to the black skull, whereas the Anglo-Teutonic skull is, I guess, in this person's view, more civilly shaped. And so what happens is that the whiteness of Eastern and Southern Europeans, it's limited, it's hierarchized by the law, even as it is consolidated, and they are technically brought under the umbrella of whiteness. And this is through the census. The census becomes this racist construct through the categories that it invents. And this process just continues to be messy. They're working backwards from classifications that they had already defined, and then they're declaring sort of causal relationships between the data, race, and these measured skulls. They counted inmates in state institutions. If statistics showed that immigrants were less healthy, less educated, and poorer than native-born Americans, that data were deemed to be evidence of these inferior physical constitutions, intelligence, ambition. And it's just developing really fast, the census. So in 1790, it was the nation's first census. It did not include information about national origin. And the census did not differentiate between foreign born until 1850. And then it did not differentiate between parental nativity of the native born until 1890. Immigration was unrecorded before 1820 and not classified according to national origin until 1899. Emigration, or leaving the United States, was not recorded at all until 1907 and not recorded according to nationality until 1909. And again, to complicate these things further, Menai says many boundaries in Europe changed after World War I. Nations changed. And so it required translations of new political geographies to really get it all to line up with this act. And then the big thing that comes is this Asian exclusion from citizenship and it being a kind of common sense. So all Asian and Black people and territories, including Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico, they are excluded from citizenship according to law and census in 1920. This meant larger quota percentages for Europeans. So remember, as they're designing this quota system, how many people they're going to decide comes from which. They've already gotten rid of everyone, all Asian people, all Black people, all people from Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico. They don't count in thinking about the racial makeup of the country that will be the basis of who they let in, right? They're like, there's this many Germans, there's this many Italians, there's this many English people, and that's how many people we're going to keep letting in that same proportion with those same quotas, but they're not counting a whole lot of different people. And also, what ends up happening is to immigrate or be a citizen at all, one needed to have a national origin, and to have a national origin, one needed to be European by blood in the logic of this national origin system. And the quote, colored races were imagined as having no country of origin. They lay outside of the concept of nationality and therefore citizenship. And so they were not even immigrants. Like the only people who could immigrate were people from Europe. Everybody else was just a non-starter, non-citizen, not an immigrant. And so then we see there's a shift because now those same categories of people become synonymous with immigrants. So there's big shifts between now and then. And so much of the logic of this rests, she says, on the idea that the members of a nation have a natural character, and immigration, therefore, is external and unnatural. When we get to Asian exclusion and we get those two very important cases, she says this is really important to what happens with the national origin system, the nativist movements, like those depicted in Gordon's the Great Arizona Orphan Abduction. They're all based in these contests over Western expansion of territory, capitalist competition for labor. But imperialists wanted good relationships with Japan and China, so they moved not to ban people by race per se, but to make deals with the home countries to restrict immigration. That's what they did before this exclusion. And this was all done, this idea of restricting citizenship and when exclusion comes about on the basis of preventing foreign invasion. There is an irony here when we consider how European descended Americans were envisioning immigration as an invasive political tactic, as a strategy of war, right? They're like, we have to stop the nativist movement was like, we have to stop this invasion of Asians because this is a kind of strategy of war from those countries. But this is often the argument that indigenous nations on the North American continent have made about European settlement, that it was a violent act, that it was an act of war. It is odd then to see the people of European descent both deny that idea, that their colonization of the continent was an extremist act of violence, and then later make that same claim about others once they establish their own territory and nationalism. Nye tells us a little more too about how the courts begin to establish those racial lines. And she says there's a failure of scientific racism, right? Tind and Ozawa and the scientific racism of the eugenics movement, they're like, scientifically, according to everything you've said, I am white. I have the traits that you say are white traits. But the judges ruled that race is slippery, that it should actually not be based on science. It should not be based on science. It should be just based on this common cultural understanding of who is inferior, who is superior, who is included, and who is not. And we get this quote from the judge in the Tind case, and we had already seen a quote from him before, but he says, quote, "We venture to think the average well-informed white American would learn with some degree of astonishment that the race to which he belongs is made up of such heterogeneous elements," meaning he would be so surprised to take a look at Tind as an Indian man and think that they were in any way related. And so he kind of mocks the premise. So after World War II, and we're going to leave that there for now, but this is sort of the idea, the premise of these racial and race and nation and national origins start to become really conflated in the U.S. imagination, and a whole immigration restriction regime is built up out of it. But after World War II, a new category of immigration restriction enters the regime scene, if we want to say, and that is the category of the refugee, someone who is distinct, not an immigrant, but someone seeking a very particular thing called refuge. The initial definition is from a nascent United Nations that emerges after the World War II, and it included people displaced and denaturalized or made stateless or nationless during World War II. So remember in the 1920s, there's these acts to denaturalize people that starts popping up outside of the US as well to make people who are naturalized or born somewhere non-citizens. That happens during World War II with mass displacement, especially with Jewish populations who are sent to Germany and Poland to camps. They are denaturalized and become stateless. And so the concept of the refugee is initially it's temporary. It has a deadline, I think a timeline of about 10 years, and it was a fairly specific redress for Jewish and other European displaced people following the events of the Holocaust, like how to get them to new homes and new places if they can't return to where they were from. Because there's this giant crisis of stateless people in Europe. The convention and protocol relating to the status of refugees, that is a UN principle. It gets expanded in 1951 and 1967. It changes the concept and timeline of the refugee, just becomes indefinite and with broader definition. So it stops being just about European people and specifically Jewish people and applies to everyone all over the world. Countries have to sign on to this protocol, and there's 140 states that are signed parties to it. The US does not sign the convention onto the convention and protocol until 1967. So, according to the Convention and Protocol, a refugee is a person who, quote, owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country, or who, not having a nationality and being outside the country of his former habitual residence as a result of such events, is unable or owing to such fear, unwell to return to it, or unwilling to return to it. This matters. This is a different thing. This is someone who is not, is being perceived as not migrating by choice, but out of this concept of well-founded fear of persecution or harm. The documentary you watched is titled Well-Founded Fear, after this principle, and it offers us a different moment in time in the management of the nation and the desirability of future citizens than what Nye offers us, and a different aspect of the system, but one with similar implications about culture and identity. It's directed by Michael Camerini and Shari Robinson. The film follows, again, a number of INS agents, because this is before 2003. and asylum applicants. And it's in 2001, right before the events of 9/11. You saw at the end of the documentary, there was like a reference, like after this, 9/11 happens and things get a bit crazy in terms of immigration restriction. This doc shows the process of asylum application in the US from arrival through to appeal from the perspectives of both the applicants and the agents assessing their claims. It highlights the challenges with rendering one's fear legible to the foreign bureaucracy and the performativity inherent to the process. It shows how a system of legal process produces a culture of suspicion about refugees and migrants and their intent, as the agents kind of psychologically spiral about whether or not they believe people's stories and what reasons they have for believing or dismissing applicants' claims. The documentary opens with a barrage of detailed questions from different voices, all American accented, over a montage of diverse and concerned faces, some nervous, some concentrating on an interpreter or translator. Most seem very unsure. The first image we see is a close up of a very put together woman, and this is the image you see here. She's in a powder blue suit and carefully coiffed bob. Her composure is betrayed by the tears brimming at the corners of her eyes. What's odd is the way we seem to get closer to her face as the camera kind of seems to notice her tears. Like we're drawn, the camera zooms in as if it's noticing that she's crying. And these are the questions that we sort of get assaulted with at the beginning. You said you were tortured. What do you mean by tortured? Tell me once again, sir, what are you afraid of? They say you make a decision, you have to live with it. And that's sort of the agents talking about this. So there's this problem of translation, of communicating. If you have to demonstrate that you have something called well-founded fear, you have to be able to communicate it. And the first asylum officer we meet is one named Kevin, and he's listening to a man named Boris. But the next person we meet is an applicant named Anna Maria. She's from Romania, and she's being interviewed by an agent named Peter. She is constantly interrupted and being in her interview with Peter to determine if she gets her refugee status or not. She is speaking English for herself. And when he asks her a question to which she is working up the answer to, she says, "We will get to that point," right? Like he keeps interrupting her and he's like, "Well, what about this?" And she's like, "We will get to that point." To which he responds, "This is my interview, not yours." This sort of tells us a little bit about the power dynamic that's in play, that it's his culture and his perceptions that will determine whether she has is successfully is she, whether she's telling the truth or not, and not her own. She can't tell her story in her own way. She has to do it in a way that he prefers, that he understands, and that he's willing to make sense of. He asks her some fact-finding questions about the sacraments because she says she's being persecuted for being Anglican. So he asks her some of those fact-finding questions about the sacraments, etc. And then he asks her who the head of the Anglican Church is, and she answers the Bishop of Gibraltar. We learn that 2 weeks after the interview, they will be called back. If their application is successful, that means they're on the road to a green card or citizenship, or if it's been unsuccessful and what they are just told is the office is unable to come to a decision and that you are referred to an immigration judge, which is a deportation hearing. They are not real courts, they're these administrative procedures. Peter is kind of smug about this. He thinks he's caught. He denies Anna Maria's claim because he thinks he's caught her out. We know later in the film that she, upon appeal, gets it reversed in the deportation hearing because he's wrong. He was like, "What kind of Anglican doesn't know the head of the Anglican Church is the Archbishop of Canterbury in England?" But Anna Maria is from Romania, and for anyone outside of England, the head of the Anglican Church is the Bishop of Gibraltar, which is what she said, also known as the bishop in Europe. So the bishop not on the island, but the bishop in Europe. So then what we learn in the film is that Peter doesn't know very much about the Anglican Church, but what he does know is from his own sort of cultural understanding and heritage. It's not based on hers, it's based on his. And that's this lack of legibility or understanding or translation that we see between the the applicants and the people who are accepting them in this system. They have to kind of already be able to express themselves Americanly in order. That's really how their truthfulness is judged. We also get a couple of instances of failed translation where people's applications get denied because their translators that they're using don't translate what they said correctly, and then the officer thinks they lied, but really it's just a mistranslation of what they said. What Anna Maria says that's really important is she says, what do these officers want from you? To beg them to fall on your knees? Do they want to see you cry? And what she's really talking about is like, how do I perform my fear in a way that they read as real fear? Like it's well-founded fear. I have to prove that I'm afraid, and I have to do it in a way that they understand. This is something that I personally know of. I have Finnish family, I have Jamaican family, and they express themselves very, very differently in terms of their emotions. And many of you might know this the same way, but so the what happens is that the refugees are it's not about telling the truth, it's about appearing to tell the truth in a way that the agents and officers understand or read as truthfulness according to their own cultural understanding of what those things look like. It's one of the challenges that the documentary presents to us by sonically focusing on those questions, zooming in on people's faces. What are they saying? What are they meaning? We get this in this filmic medium. We also understand that Peter calls it asylum roulette, that there's a little bit of luck involved here. And also prior knowledge to American cultural norms is helpful. In one of the conversations between Kevin and another, who's one of the agents, and another unnamed agent, they discuss the possible bias they might have towards educated people because they are more articulate and provide more credible details. But they conclude that it's not a bias in the end. They talk themselves out of it. But the question there is about credibility. It seems credibility and understandability, what we might call legibility and readability, go hand in hand. If the performance of the testimony needs to be understandable to the person who is hearing you out. But what we also get is a culture of suspicion that develops amongst the agents. So Hannah Arendt, who's a Jewish philosopher who wrote extensively about Nazi Germany and the concept of totalitarianism, she wrote in her essay, We Refugees, that the natives confronted with such strange beings as we are become suspicious from their point of view. As a rule, only a loyalty to our old countries is understandable. So already, she says, the refugee is already suspicious because the native born person who is interviewing them or assessing their claim does not understand why anyone necessarily they can't understand that concept of abandoning one's country in this way or forfeiting it, because that's what you have to do as a refugee. You have to state that you um, reject your nation, your home nation in a particular way. Whereas with a lot of immigration, you don't have to do that necessarily. You don't have to declare that your other country is like evil or bad. But with refugees, you do have to do that, at least in this process. But also there's this thing with the desirability of the other, which is that all of the agents are really become kind of obsessive with figuring out if the refugees are telling the truth or not. The documentary shows us that the system itself, its interrogation procedures, makes the agents kind of paranoid. Their job is to sort truth from lies, so they assume that some percentage must be lies. They assume everyone must be lying. At least a lot of people must be lying. that they are looking at liars and need to catch them. They are also in a system that tells them that sorting this is important to the nation. They begin to think too of the applicants as enemies, imagining that they are mocking the agents when they get into the country or get one over on them. The procedural system they are caught up in seems to be seducing them into a particular mindset about a created other, wolves in sheep's clothing, despite the fact that anyone seeking asylum is deeply vulnerable to the system, and especially to the agents. The agents have complete power, they can deport them pretty much right away. And the people seeking asylum, they have no state backing because they've abandoned their home countries and they have no power to wield over the agent or anyone else. The image you see here, too, the woman has a black eye. And a part of how we detect these issues is through the absurdity and contradictions of each agent's reasoning, how they determine how determined they are to be suspicious of really innocuous aspects of people's stories. Gerald, a new officer we meet who has gray and thinning hair, he says a pile of paper is a good indicator that an NGO has done research on the person, and so it is likely a good claim. But then the documentarians say, the other agents say a pile of paperwork might indicate that the person is trying to cover fakeness of their claim with bullshit. And there's all these contradictions. So anything could be evidence of a lie, literally anything. Peter says that he believes that some inconsistencies actually prove that someone is telling the truth. But we saw him deny Anna Maria's claim over an inconsistency and one he was wrong about. But he was determined to catch her out. He really laughs and makes fun of her. And he says, what kind of person doesn't know this thing? Well, he's that kind of person. He didn't know who the head of the Anglican Church was in Europe. Jim is another agent, and he says he's determined to catch the Chinese. Especially, he thinks of them as crafty and trying to sneak in. And he says, I realize that sounds sinister, but it's what you have to do. The system sort of encourages him to be like catching and seeking them out. He also says to another coworker later, who, when that coworker says, like, we've got all the cards, we've got all the power, Jim says, but don't you think that privately they laugh at us because nothing happens to them with a fraudulent claim? But something does happen to them. They get deported for the most part. Like he denies their claim and they get deported, but he starts to think about them as like plotting against him, as trying to get one by him, and is also making fun of him if they get in. Jim later says, I think you become cynical. And then he says you get in this mindset where you just don't want to take crap from people. You want to catch them out. So there's an interesting relationship between the way the agents in Well-Founded Fear catalog behaviors and people as they go along and the way Olivares in that poem tags behaviors. Olivares' bracketed tags, citizen and illegal, seem to embody the voice of that pervasive suspicion around citizenship and immigration that he faces as a Mexican American person. Each of the agents acts as a kind of voice in their own assessments, determining whether a certain action or tendency is evidence of a person's true status as a refugee and potential American, or their concealed status as, well, what? What is the opposite of a refugee? That brings us to our critical questions. Olivares looks at himself through the binary of citizen and illegal, but if we were to rewrite this poem using the applicants and agents from Well-Founded Fear, what bracketed tags would we put beside the different actions and evidence? So is a stack of papers and evidence in not it's refugee or what? Or illegal or non-citizen or non-American? What is the opposite there? Um, what makes, and then we have some further questions. What makes someone American? A set of traits, a racial ethnic category, a culture? Can someone identify as American without legal status and citizenship? How tied to citizenship and legal status is the category American? At what point does an immigrant or a refugee become American? And then further, at what point did Thomas Jefferson become American? The United States did not exist for much of his life. At what point did he become American, if people can become it, and how? That's the reminder of the provocation again. Again, you can find it posted in the supplementary files on Canvas. Next time, we are looking at Sven Beckert's Empire of Cotton and a selection from Mark Lamont Hill's Nobody. We're still thinking about this idea of the other, but also thinking about the global relations between people and how we treat them and the movement of money. And that is it for today. I will see you next week.